It was just another busy morning at Singapore International Airport when a woman in her early 40s quietly made her way through the terminal, pulling a simple carry-on bag behind her. Unlike her usual power suits and designer accessories, today she wore faded jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and comfortable sneakers. Mrs. Lee, the CEO of SkyAsia Airlines, had a secret routine that none of her 15,000 employees knew about. She regularly flew economy class on her own airline to experience things exactly as her passengers did. Today's flight was a packed route from Singapore to Tokyo, one of their most profitable connections. As she settled into her cramped seat in row 32, she couldn't help but smile at the flight attendant who barely glanced at her boarding pass. That was exactly what she wanted, to be treated like any other passenger. The middle-aged businessman sitting next to her was already deeply focused on his laptop, while a young mother across the aisle struggled to calm her crying baby. Mrs. Lee watched with interest as different crew members passed by, noting how they interacted with passengers. Some offered warm smiles and assistance, while others seemed more concerned with rushing through their tasks. That's when she first noticed him, Flight Attendant Singh, whose name badge gleamed under the cabin lights. He moved through the aisle with military precision, checking overhead bins and scolding passengers whose bags weren't properly stored. His perfectly pressed uniform and rigid posture made him stand out among the other crew members. "Excuse me, your bag needs to be completely under the seat," he told a teenage girl in front of Mrs. Lee, his voice stern but professional. The girl quickly pushed her backpack further down with her feet, looking slightly intimidated. Mrs. Lee made a mental note. While safety rules were important, perhaps there was a way to enforce them more gently. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Mrs. Lee pulled out her phone to make a few final notes before switching it off. She'd been planning to review the airline's customer service protocols anyway, and this flight would give her perfect first-hand experience. The fact that none of the crew recognized her made everything even better. She could see exactly how they behaved when they thought management wasn't watching. The takeoff was smooth, and as they reached cruising altitude, Mrs. Lee settled in for what she thought would be a routine flight. She opened her book, adjusted her long black hair that fell past her shoulders, and accepted a cup of water from a smiling junior flight attendant. Everything was going according to plan. She was just another face in the crowd, observing, learning, and gathering insights to make her airline better. Little did she know that her simple disguise and this ordinary flight were about to turn into one of the most memorable moments in her airline's history. As the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began moving around the cabin, she had no idea that her next interaction with Flight Attendant Singh would not only test her patience as a leader, but would also completely transform the way her entire company approached customer service. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as they headed into a cloud bank, and Mrs. Lee gazed out at the wing, reflecting on how far her airline had come since she'd taken over as CEO 5 years ago. But sometimes the best lessons come when you least expect them, and today's flight was about to prove that in ways she could never have imagined. The first sign of trouble came about 2 hours into the flight when the plane hit an unexpected patch of turbulence. Mrs. Lee's water cup jumped on her tray table, spilling some of its contents onto her book. As she reached for the napkins, the plane shook again, harder this time, causing her to accidentally knock the rest of the water onto her seatmate's laptop bag. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, quickly helping the businessman move his bag away from the puddle. As she leaned forward to help clean up the mess, her long hair swung forward, briefly brushing against her seatmate's food tray. The businessman smiled politely and assured her it wasn't a problem, but someone else had noticed the incident. Flight Attendant Singh appeared almost instantly, like he'd been waiting for something to go wrong. "Madam," he said in that crisp, authoritative voice of his, "your hair touching the food tray is a serious health code violation." He stood there, ramrod straight, looking down at her through his wire-rimmed glasses. Mrs. Lee calmly tucked her hair behind her ears. "I apologize. It was an accident due to the turbulence. It won't happen again." But Singh wasn't satisfied. Our airline policy clearly states that all hair longer than shoulder length must be tied back during meal service. Do you have a hair tie, madam? The businessman next to her shifted uncomfortably in his seat, obviously feeling awkward about the growing tension. Other passengers nearby started to turn around, curious about what was happening. I'm afraid I don't, Mrs. Lee replied, maintaining her composure despite feeling all eyes on her. But I'll be extra careful to keep my hair away from other passengers. Singh's face tightened. That's not acceptable, madam. This is a health and safety issue. He turned to his drink cart and began rummaging through a compartment. If you don't have a hair tie, we'll need to find another solution. A young flight attendant named Miss Wong approached cautiously. Mr. Singh, perhaps I have a spare hair tie in mind. That won't be necessary. Singh cut her off, turning back to Mrs. Lee with something in his hand that made several nearby passengers gasp. It was a pair of scissors from the plane's emergency kit. Either we solve this problem now, he declared, holding up the scissors, or I'll have to report this as a serious violation, which could result in us making an unscheduled landing to remove you from the flight. The cabin fell so quiet you could hear the hum of the engines. Mrs. Lee looked at the scissors, then at the faces of shocked passengers around her. She could have revealed her identity right then. One word about who she was would have ended this immediately. But 20 years of business experience had taught her that sometimes the best way to understand a problem was to let it play out. Very well, she said quietly, surprising everyone. If those are my only options, you may cut my hair. Miss Wong's hand flew to her mouth. An elderly lady 3 rows back muttered, "This isn't right." Even the businessman next to Mrs. Lee started to protest, but she held up her hand to stop him. Singh, perhaps surprised by her cooperation, but determined to enforce the rules, moved behind her seat. Mrs. Lee sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, as the first snip of the scissors echoed through the silent cabin. A lock of her black hair fell to the floor, followed by another. What happened next would change not just Singh's life, but the entire culture of the airline. As the scissors made their third cut, a voice from the back of the plane shouted something that made Singh's blood run cold. "Stop! That's our CEO." The shout came from Mrs. Wong, a senior flight attendant who had worked for the airline for over 20 years. She had seen Mrs. Lee's face on enough company newsletters to recognize her, even in casual clothes. The scissors in Singh's hand froze mid-cut. The metal gleamed under the cabin lights as his hand began to tremble. Several chunks of Mrs. Lee's hair already lay scattered on the floor around her seat. The neat cut she'd gotten just last week now transformed into an uneven mess. A wave of whispers swept through the cabin. The CEO. She's the owner? Did he really just cut her hair? Phones came out as passengers tried to look up pictures of the airline's chief executive, comparing them to the woman sitting calmly in economy class. Singh's face had turned the color of old paper. The scissors slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor, making a sound that seemed to echo through the now silent aircraft. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. 23 years of perfect service records, and now this. He had just cut the CEO's hair while lecturing her about company policy. Mrs. Lee slowly stood up, careful not to step on the scattered locks of her hair. She turned to face Singh, and for the first time, he saw her clearly, really saw her. The kind eyes that often appeared in staff meetings, the gentle smile that graced company advertisements, and now, the uneven haircut he had given her. Mrs. Lee, I'd. Singh's voice cracked. His perfectly pressed uniform suddenly felt too tight, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. Around them, passengers watched with a mixture of shock and fascination, wondering how this scene would play out. Instead of showing anger, Mrs. Lee did something unexpected. She picked up the scissors from the floor and handed them back to Singh. "These should be returned to the emergency kit," she said softly. Then, touching her now uneven hair, she added, Though I must say, this is certainly a unique way to handle a situation. The elderly lady who had protested earlier couldn't contain herself. You're not going to fire him, after what he did. Mrs. Lee looked thoughtfully at Singh, who seemed to be shrinking into himself with each passing second. Right now, she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, I think we all need to take a deep breath and remember that we're still on a flight with 4 hours to go. Mr. Singh, please continue your duties. We'll discuss this after we land. Miss Wong quickly approached with a cup of water for Singh, who looked like he might faint. His hands shook so badly that he nearly spilled it. Another flight attendant hurried to clean up the hair from the floor, looking anywhere but at Mrs. Lee's face. The businessman sitting next to Mrs. Lee finally spoke up. You know, in all my years of flying, I've never seen anything quite like this. But I've also never seen a CEO handle something so gracefully. Mrs. Lee smiled as she sat back down, adjusting her now shorter hair. Sometimes the best way to understand your company is to experience it exactly as your customers do, even if that experience includes an unexpected haircut. As Singh retreated to the galley, passengers could see him leaning against the wall, taking deep breaths. Miss Wong patted his back sympathetically while whispering something in his ear. The other crew members moved through the cabin in a daze, trying to resume normal service while stealing glances at their CEO. The rest of the flight crew knew that this incident would change everything. But none of them could have predicted exactly how Mrs. Lee would use this moment to transform not just their airline, but the entire industry's approach to customer service. As the plane continued its journey to Tokyo, the story of the CEO's haircut was already spreading through text messages and social media, though the biggest surprises were still to come. The next 4 hours of the flight felt like an eternity for everyone on board. Mrs. Lee pulled out her laptop and began typing, pausing occasionally to run her fingers through her newly shortened hair. In the galley, the flight crew whispered among themselves, stealing worried glances at both their CEO and Singh, who had transformed from his usually confident self into a shadow of a man. I've never seen him like this, Miss Wong whispered to Mrs. Wong as they prepared the arrival snacks. He hasn't said a word for the past hour. They watched as Singh mechanically went through his duties, his movements stiff, and his eyes fixed straight ahead, avoiding contact with everyone. The businessman sitting next to Mrs. Lee had offered her his phone's front camera so she could see what her hair looked like. The cut was uneven, with one side noticeably shorter than the other. Instead of being upset, she had smiled and said, "Well, I was planning to try a new style anyway." Word of the incident had spread throughout the plane. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, walked up to Mrs. Lee's seat clutching a small brush. "My mom says you can borrow this," she said shyly. "She uses it to fix my hair when it gets messy." Mrs. Lee's eyes softened as she accepted the brush. "That's very kind of you," she said, gently smoothing down her choppy locks. Sometimes the nicest things come from unexpected places, don't they? As the plane began its descent into Tokyo, passengers started sharing their contact information, eager to stay updated on what would happen next. A college student asked if she could write about this for her business ethics class. An old man mentioned that he'd been flying with the airline for 30 years and had never seen anything quite like this. Singh remained in the galley during landing preparation, his hands trembling slightly as he secured the cabin. Miss Wong tried to comfort him, saying, "At least she didn't get angry." But Singh shook his head. "I would have preferred anger," he said quietly. "This calm. It's worse. 23 years of service ended because I couldn't show common sense." When the plane touched down at Narita International Airport, no one rushed to get up as they usually would. Instead, all eyes turned to Mrs. Lee, wondering what would happen next. She gathered her things unhurriedly, tucking her laptop into her bag and smoothing down her shortened hair one last time. Singh stood by the exit door, preparing for the usual farewell routine. As passengers began to deplane, he kept his eyes down, barely managing to mumble, "Thank you for flying with us," to each person. Many gave him sympathetic looks as they passed, while others shook their heads in disapproval. When Mrs. Lee reached the door, she stopped. Singh finally looked up, his face a mix of shame and resignation. To everyone's surprise, she smiled at him, not a cold or forced smile, but a genuine one that reached her eyes. "Mr. Singh," she said softly, "please join me in the terminal after you've completed your duties. And don't worry about writing up an incident report. I think I have a pretty good understanding of what happened." The other flight attendants watched in amazement as their CEO walked calmly into the terminal, her uneven hair catching the morning sunlight. Passengers lingered near the gate, some pretending to check their phones while actually waiting to see what would unfold next. Miss Wong touched Singh's arm gently. "Maybe it won't be as bad as you think," she said. But Singh just straightened his tie and squared his shoulders, preparing himself for what he was sure would be his last day with the airline. Little did he know that Mrs. Lee had already begun drafting a company-wide email that would change everything, not just for him, but for every employee in their airline. As she waited in the terminal, she realized that sometimes the best lessons in leadership come from the most unexpected and uncomfortable situations. 20 minutes after landing, Singh walked into the terminal, his footsteps heavy with dread. He found Mrs. Lee sitting at a quiet coffee shop near Gate 52, 2 steaming cups already on the table in front of her. Several passengers from the flight lingered nearby, pretending to be absorbed in their phones while actually watching the scene unfold. "Please, sit down," Mrs. Lee said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. She pushed one of the coffee cups toward him. "I remember from your employee file that you prefer green tea to coffee." Singh lowered himself into the chair, surprised she knew this detail about him. His hands were shaking so badly that the tea rippled when he picked up the cup. "Mrs. Lee, I cannot begin to express my—" She held up her hand, stopping his apology. "Before you continue, I'd like to tell you a story." She touched her uneven hair thoughtfully. "When I first started as a flight attendant 30 years ago, I made a terrible mistake." Singh's eyes widened. Like most employees, he knew their CEO had started at the bottom, but he'd never heard her talk about her early days. "I was so focused on following rules that I made an elderly man throw away his water bottle just before a 4-hour delay on the tarmac. He was diabetic and needed to take his medicine. He ended up needing medical attention." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I followed the rules perfectly that day, but I failed at something far more important, being human." A few tears slipped down Singh's cheeks, but he sat straight, accepting whatever judgment was coming. Outside the coffee shop window, planes took off into the bright morning sky, their engines humming with possibility. "The difference is," Mrs. Lee continued, "my mistake taught me something valuable. Tell me, what did you learn today?" Singh's voice was barely a whisper. "That rules without compassion are just words on paper. That I was so focused on being right, I forgot about being kind." He looked up at her, his eyes red. "I've spent 23 years thinking perfect service meant perfect rule enforcement. Today I realized I couldn't have been more wrong." Mrs. Lee nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "And that's exactly why you're not fired." The relief on Singh's face was immediately replaced by confusion. "But I cut your hair. I humiliated you in front of an entire plane." "I—" "Yes, you did," she agreed. "And now you're going to help me fix something much bigger than my haircut." She pulled out her tablet and showed him an email draft. "I'm launching a new training program called Humanity in Flight. It will teach our staff how to balance rules with human understanding. And you, Mr. Singh, will be one of our main instructors." Singh nearly spilled his tea. "Me? But after what I did." "Exactly because of what you did. Who better to teach about the importance of compassion than someone who learned its value the hard way?" She smiled. "Your experience today will help thousands of other employees understand that good service isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding people." A small crowd had gathered near the coffee shop, including several crew members who should have been preparing for their next flights. They watched as their strictest colleague wiped his eyes with a napkin, nodding as their CEO continued explaining her vision. Starting next week, you'll work with our training department to develop the program. Your first presentation will be your own story. What happened today, what you learned, and how it changed your perspective. For the first time since the incident, Singh's posture relaxed slightly. You're giving me a chance to make this right. Mrs. Lee stood up, gathering her things. No, Mr. Singh. You're giving all of us a chance to make the entire airline better. She touched her uneven hair again and smiled. Though I would appreciate it if you left the haircuts to the professionals from now on. As they both stood to leave, scattered applause broke out from the onlookers. The story of the CEO's haircut was already spreading through airline staff chat groups, but now it had a surprising ending. One that would inspire changes throughout the entire industry. News of the incident spread like wildfire through the airline's offices. By the time Mrs. Lee returned to headquarters the next morning, her inbox was flooded with emails from concerned board members and curious employees. Her new haircut, now professionally evened out at a local salon, made her easy to spot as she walked through the office. I've called an all-hands meeting, her assistant told her, hurrying alongside with the tablet in hand. Everyone's waiting in the main conference hall. He paused, glancing at her hair. The board members are concerned about the social media attention. Indeed, passengers from the flight had shared the story online. A video of Singh cutting her hair had already gathered millions of views. Some commenters called for his firing, while others praised Mrs. Lee's calm response. #Airline CEO haircut was trending on several platforms. The main conference hall was packed. Hundreds of employees filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. Singh sat in the front row, looking uncomfortable in his freshly pressed uniform. The room fell silent as Mrs. Lee walked to the podium, all eyes drawn to her shorter hairstyle. "Good morning," she began, her voice warm and steady. "I'm sure you've all heard various versions of what happened on yesterday's flight to Tokyo. Some of them might even be true." A gentle laugh rippled through the crowd. "But today, I want to tell you what really happened, and more importantly, what we're going to learn from it." She gestured for Singh to join her at the podium. He walked up slowly, his face flushed. The whispers in the room grew louder until Mrs. Lee raised her hand for silence. "Mr. Singh made a decision yesterday based on his understanding of our rules," she continued. "Was it the right decision? No. Was it a decision many of us might have made in similar circumstances? Let's be honest with ourselves. Probably yes." She turned to the screen behind her, where photographs of various airline rulebooks appeared. Our company has 847 pages of rules and regulations. Every one of them was created for a good reason. But somewhere along the way, we forgot something crucial. Rules should guide us, not control us. Mrs. Lee clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph from her early days as a flight attendant. 30 years ago, I was just like Mr. Singh. I believed that perfect service meant perfect rule enforcement. I was wrong, and it took a difficult experience to teach me that lesson. The room was completely silent now, everyone leaning forward to catch every word. Even the board members, who had arrived ready to manage a crisis, looked intrigued. Starting today, we're launching Humanity in Flight, a complete overhaul of our training program. Mr. Singh will help lead this initiative, sharing his experience as a reminder that true service comes from the heart, not just the handbook. She pulled out a pair of scissors from her pocket, the same ones used on the flight. Gasps echoed through the room. These scissors taught us all a valuable lesson. They'll be displayed in our training center as a reminder that sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most important improvements. Singh stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly but growing stronger as he spoke. Yesterday, I thought I was upholding our standards. Today, I understand that the highest standard we can aim for is treating each person, passenger, or colleague, with dignity and understanding. The first person to stand and applaud was the elderly board chairman. Others quickly followed, until the entire room was on their feet. Mrs. Lee saw tears in the eyes of many veteran flight attendants who had probably faced similar dilemmas between rules and compassion. As the applause died down, she made one final announcement. And yes, for those wondering, I'm keeping the short hair. Sometimes change looks good on us. The laughter and renewed applause that followed felt like the beginning of something new, not just for their airline, but for the entire industry. Outside the conference hall, a young flight attendant turned to her colleague and whispered, "You know what's amazing?" She turned what could have been a huge scandal into a moment of growth for everyone. Her friend nodded, adding, "That's why she's the boss." Over the next few weeks, the airline's training center buzzed with new energy. The infamous scissors sat in a clear display case near the entrance, with a simple plaque reading, "Rules guide us. Humanity defines us." Each morning, new groups of flight attendants gathered around it, listening as Singh shared his story. "I used to think my perfect record was my biggest achievement," he would tell them, standing tall in his uniform. "Now I know that my biggest achievement was learning to be wrong." The trainees would lean forward, captivated by the honest emotion in his voice as he described that fateful flight. One particularly memorable training session included the young girl who had offered her hair brushed to Mrs. Lee on the plane. Her mother, a frequent flyer, had been invited to share their perspective. "What struck me wasn't the haircut itself," the mother told the class. "It was how a moment of tension turned into a lesson about kindness." The airline's customer service started changing in small but noticeable ways. A flight attendant held a crying baby so a single mother could eat her meal. Another found a way to accommodate an elderly man's oversized medicine bag without breaking safety rules. Each week, employees shared their stories of finding the balance between rules and compassion. Mrs. Lee received an unexpected letter from the businessman who had sat next to her during the infamous haircut. "I've flown millions of miles," he wrote, "but I've never seen leadership like this. You didn't just handle a crisis, you turned it into an opportunity to make air travel more human." International media picked up the story. News channels ran special features about the CEO, who used her own haircut incident to transform her company's culture. Business schools started using the case in their leadership classes. Other airlines began reaching out, wanting to learn more about the Humanity in Flight program. Singh found himself becoming an unlikely celebrity in the airline industry. His training sessions were always full, with staff from other airlines sometimes joining in. "The hardest part," he would say, "wasn't the moment I realized who she was. It was the moment I realized who I had become. Someone so focused on rules that I'd forgotten about the people they were meant to serve." One day, a new flight attendant asked Singh if he regretted what happened. He looked at the scissors in their display case and smiled. "I regret causing Mrs. Lee discomfort," he said, "but I don't regret the lesson it taught me. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best changes." The airline's customer satisfaction scores began climbing. Passengers shared stories online about their experiences, often mentioning how different the atmosphere felt on board. "It's like they found the perfect balance," one review read. "They're professional, but also wonderfully human." Mrs. Lee kept her hair short, turning it into a personal trademark. During a television interview, when asked if she had forgiven Singh, she laughed. "Forgive him? I should thank him. Sometimes we need someone to show us where we've gone wrong, even if the method is a bit unconventional." The training center became known for its unique approach. Instead of just memorizing rules, trainees learned to understand the human stories behind them. They practiced handling difficult situations with both firmness and kindness, always remembering the scissors that changed everything. "You know what's remarkable?" Mrs. Wang said to Miss Wang as they watched a new group of trainees gather around Singh. "A month ago, we thought this would destroy his career. Now he's teaching others how to be better." Miss Wong nodded, remembering how she'd comforted Singh on that flight. It's amazing how one moment can change so many lives, she replied. And to think, it all started with a haircut. As the airline industry faced new challenges and changes, one thing remained constant. The story of the CEO's haircut continued to inspire people to find humanity in every situation, reminding them that sometimes the best solutions come from the heart rather than the rulebook. 6 months after the haircut incident, the airline hosted its annual Staff Appreciation Day. The event was different this year. Instead of formal speeches and awards, employees gathered to share stories of how the Humanity in Flight program had changed their work and lives. The hotel ballroom was packed with staff from all departments. Flight attendants in crisp uniforms sat next to maintenance crew members in their work clothes. Behind the stage hung a giant photo of those famous scissors, now a symbol of the airline's transformation. A young flight attendant stood up to share her story. "Last week, I had a passenger who was terrified of flying," she began. "The old me would have just handed him the safety card and moved on. Instead, I'd remembered Mr. Singh's lessons about looking beyond the rules. I spent a few minutes talking to him, explaining every sound and bump. By the end of the flight, he was actually smiling." The crowd nodded in understanding. Another staff member raised his hand. "Yesterday, a family missed their connection because their first flight was delayed. The rulebook says they should wait for the next available flight, tomorrow. But I remembered our new training. I called 3 other airlines and found them seats on a partner flight that evening. The mother started crying when I told her they'd make it to her son's graduation after all." Mrs. Lee sat in the audience, listening to story after story. Her hair, still stylishly short, had become something of a trademark. Airlines around the world had started sending their managers to learn from their training program. Even competitors admitted that something special was happening. Singh walked onto the stage, no longer the rigid rule enforcer he once was. His smile was warm as he addressed the crowd. "Someone recently asked me if I keep a copy of the rulebook with me anymore," he said. "I told them yes, but now I also carry something more important: the memory of how it feels to be on both sides of a difficult situation." He pointed to a group of new trainees in the back. These fresh graduates just finished their first week of training. When I asked them what they learned, one of them said something that touched my heart. She said, "I learned that every passenger is someone's loved one. Every suitcase holds someone's dreams, and every rule should be guided by human understanding." The room buzzed with energy as more people shared their experiences. A ground crew member told about helping an elderly couple navigate a complicated rebooking. A baggage handler described going the extra mile to reunite a child with a lost stuffed animal. Each story showed how the airline had changed. During a break, Mrs. Wang approached Mrs. Lee with tears in her eyes. "Remember how worried we all were when this story first hit the news?" she asked. "Now look at us. Other airlines are copying our training program. Our customer satisfaction scores are the highest they've ever been. And it all started with a haircut," Mrs. Lee finished, laughing. "Though I must admit, I never thought I'd be grateful for a bad hair day." The afternoon ended with a surprise announcement. The airline was launching a scholarship program for students interested in aviation. The scholarship's name? The Scissors Fund, Cutting Through Rules to Find Humanity. As people began leaving the ballroom, a veteran pilot stopped to chat with Singh. "You know what's funny?" the pilot said. "For years, we thought perfect service meant perfect rule following. Now we know it means perfect understanding." Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in beautiful colors as planes took off and landed. Each one carried not just passengers, but also the spirit of what the airline had become. A place where rules and humanity worked together to create something special. That evening, as Mrs. Lee walked through the airport terminal, she overheard a passenger telling her friend, "Try to book with this airline if you can. There's just something different about them, something more human." Mrs. Lee smiled, touching her short hair. Sometimes the best changes come from unexpected places, and sometimes a mistake, handled with grace, can transform not just a company, but an entire industry's understanding of what good service really means. 1 year after the famous haircut incident, a special ceremony took place at the airline's headquarters. The company was celebrating not just its highest customer satisfaction ratings ever, but also a complete change in how the aviation industry viewed customer service. The main lobby had been transformed for the occasion. Photos lined the walls showing moments of exceptional service captured throughout the year. A flight attendant helping an elderly passenger with her medication. A ground crew member running through the rain to deliver a forgotten passport. And countless other small acts of kindness that had become the airline's new trademark. The famous scissors still held their place of honor, but now they were surrounded by handwritten thank you notes from passengers. Your staff helped my daughter through her first flight alone, one read. They didn't just follow procedures, they made her feel safe and cared for. Mrs. Lee stood at the podium, her short hair now an inspiration for many in the company. 1 year ago, she began, a pair of scissors taught us something invaluable. They showed us that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest improvements. She gestured to Singh, who sat in the front row. Mr. Singh, would you please join me? As he walked to the stage, the audience broke into warm applause. Gone was the stiff, rule-bound flight attendant of a year ago. In his place stood a man who had helped transform an entire industry's approach to customer service. Today, Mrs. Lee continued, we're not just celebrating better numbers or higher ratings. We're celebrating a return to something essential, the understanding that behind every rule, every procedure, and every policy, there are human beings with real stories, real feelings, and real needs. The airline had become famous for its unique approach. Other companies sent their staff to learn from them. Business schools taught their story, but most importantly, passengers felt the difference. It's like being welcomed into someone's home, one frequent flyer commented. They know all the professional rules, but they also know when to be simply human. Singh stepped up to the microphone, his voice full of emotion. A year ago, I thought I was going to lose my job. Instead, I found my true calling. Every day, I tell new trainees, the rules are important, but the people are more important. The ceremony included videos from passengers sharing their experiences. A mother talked about how the crew had organized a small birthday celebration for her child during a long flight. An old man described how a flight attendant had sat with him during turbulence, holding his hand because he was scared. Mrs. Wang and Miss Wang, who had witnessed the original incident, sat together, remembering that dramatic flight. Who would have thought, Miss Wang whispered, that a moment we thought would ruin us would end up making us better. Near the end of the ceremony, a surprise guest appeared, the little girl who had offered her hairbrush to Mrs. Lee on that famous flight. Now a year older, she presented Mrs. Lee with a new hairbrush, wrapped in a ribbon. Mom says sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can make the biggest difference, she said, making everyone smile. As the celebration came to a close, Mrs. Lee made one final announcement. Starting next month, our Humanity in Flight program will be shared freely with other airlines. Because making air travel more compassionate and human isn't just good for our company. It's good for everyone who steps onto an airplane anywhere in the world. The applause that followed wasn't just for the announcement. It was for everything the past year had taught them. That rules work best when balanced with compassion, that mistakes can lead to positive change, and that sometimes the most powerful leadership lessons come from unexpected moments. Outside, as the sun set behind the airport's control tower, planes took off into the golden sky. Each one carried not just passengers and cargo, but also a new understanding of what it means to serve others. And somewhere in the quiet moments between takeoff and landing, countless small acts of kindness continued to prove that the biggest change in aviation history had started with a simple haircut and the courage to learn from it.